You ever notice how the quiet ones make everyone else uneasy? The question drifted across the hot afternoon air, low and almost casual, but it carried just enough weight to make a few heads turn along the edge of the tarmac. The base was alive with movement, boots striking concrete in steady rhythms, radios crackling with clipped efficiency, the distant hum of rotor blades cutting through the dry Texas sky. And in the middle of it all, walking slower than everything around him, was an old man. He moved with measured steps, not weak, not uncertain, just deliberate, as if every foot he placed had already been considered long before it touched the ground. His jacket was faded olive, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, the kind of wear that didn't come from fashion but from time. No rank, no insignia, nothing that demanded attention. And yet, without quite understanding why, people shifted slightly as he passed. Not much, just enough to let him through. Corporal Jake Turner noticed it immediately. Turner leaned against a metal barricade near the restricted zone, arms crossed, mirrored sunglasses catching the glare of the sun. 23 years old, top of his class, and already convinced he understood how the world worked. He watched the old man approach, watched the way a pair of junior airmen subtly stepped aside without being told. That didn't sit right with him. Not on his watch. "Sir, hold up," Turner called out, pushing off the barricade and stepping directly into the old man's path. The movement was sharp, intentional, a line drawn in the dust. The old man stopped. Not abruptly, just stopped. His eyes lifted, pale and steady, meeting Turner's gaze without challenge, without apology. It wasn't defiance. It was something else. Something that made Turner feel, for a brief second, like he had just interrupted something important without knowing what it was. "This area is restricted," Turner continued, voice firm, rehearsed authority rolling easily off his tongue. "I'm gonna need to see some ID." The old man didn't reach for his pocket, didn't argue, didn't even sigh. He just looked at Turner, as if measuring the moment instead of reacting to it. Around them, the rhythm of the bass didn't stop, but it shifted. Conversations softened. A nearby crew chief paused mid-sentence. A radio operator glanced up from his console, frowning slightly, as if trying to remember something just out of reach. The wind carried a faint hiss through the antennas, a whisper buried inside static. Turner felt it too, though he couldn't explain it. That quiet pressure, like standing too close to something you didn't understand. "You lost, sir," he added, a sharper edge creeping into his tone now, filling the silence that the old man refused to break. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the old man spoke, his voice low, roughened by time, but steady as steel. No, just that. No explanation. No defense. Just a single word that seemed to settle into the ground beneath them. Turner exhaled through his nose, irritation flickering across his face. He'd dealt with civilians before. Confused retirees, contractors who thought rules didn't apply to them. This was no different. It couldn't be. And yet, that feeling didn't go away. Behind him, the radio operator adjusted his headset, the static sharpening for a split second before clearing, leaving behind the faintest echo of something that almost sounded like a word. Turner didn't hear it. Not clearly, but somewhere in the background, unnoticed and unrecognized, a name was beginning to surface. Turner shifted his weight, the heat pressing against his uniform as the silence stretched longer than it should have. And for the first time since he had stepped into the old man's path, the situation felt uneven, like he had misread something simple, and it was quietly correcting him without asking permission. He tightened his jaw and reached out, not aggressive but firm, gesturing toward the old man's jacket. "Sir, I need identification." "That is not optional." The old man's gaze did not drop to the hand, did not follow the gesture. It stayed exactly where it had been, steady and unreadable, as if the request itself had not yet earned a response. Around them, the air seemed to thicken, the steady rhythm of boots and engines now carrying a faint hesitation, conversations cutting off half a sentence too early. A mechanic across the tarmac lowering his wrench without realizing he had stopped working. Behind Turner, the radio operator adjusted the dial again, frowning deeper this time as the static sharpened into something more defined, a clipped burst that slipped through before dissolving. And though it was barely audible, it carried a tone that did not belong to routine traffic. The operator leaned closer, instinct overriding protocol. his fingers hovering over the controls as if he was about to hear something important but could not yet prove it. Turner exhaled slowly, irritation building now, fueled by the old man's silence. By the way, nothing about him matched the situation, yet nothing about him felt out of place either. "Look," Turner said, voice harder now, projecting authority the way he had been trained. "This is an active operations zone. You cannot just walk through here because you feel like it. If you do not have clearance, you need to turn around." The old man finally moved, but not in the way Turner expected. He did not reach for a wallet or argue his case. He simply turned his head slightly, eyes drifting past Turner for a brief moment, as if checking something beyond him, something only he could see, and then returned his attention without urgency. "I am where I need to be," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that did not match their volume, settling into the space between them like something already decided. Turner felt it again, that subtle pressure, the sense that the conversation was happening on a level he was not controlling, and it made his grip on the situation tighten. He took a half step closer, closing the distance, reinforcing the line he believed he held. "That is not how this works," he replied, his tone now edged with impatience. "Rules apply to everyone." A few feet away, Staff Sergeant Lucas Reed had been watching the exchange from beside a supply truck, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, tracking every detail with the quiet awareness that came from years of experience. He had seen arguments like this before, seen civilians wander where they should not, seen young Marines handle it exactly the way Turner was handling it now. But something about this was off, not dramatic, not obvious, just wrong in a way that made his instincts lean forward. It was in the old man's stance, the stillness that did not read as hesitation, the way he absorbed the confrontation without reacting to it, like he had already lived through moments that made this one too small to matter. Reed glanced toward the radio operator just as another flicker of static slipped through, longer this time, carrying a fragment that made the operator freeze for half a second before shaking his head as if he had imagined it. Reed's eyes narrowed slightly, a memory brushing the edge of recognition, something buried in briefings long past, something he had not thought about in years. Back at the line, Turner's patience finally snapped into action. "All right," he said, straightening, his voice loud enough now to draw clear attention. "If you are not going to cooperate, I am going to have to escort you out." The old man did not move. He did not step back. He did not step forward. He simply stood there, the same quiet presence in the middle of a base that suddenly felt like it was waiting for something to happen, even if no one could yet say what it was. Turner reached for the old man's arm, not roughly, not with force, but with the firm intention of ending the situation on his terms. And that was when something subtle shifted, not in movement, not in posture, but in the space around them. Like the moment before a storm breaks when the air turns heavy and still, his fingers stopped just short of contact, hovering for a fraction of a second longer than they should have, because up close, something did not match the image he had built in his head. The fabric of the jacket was worn but clean, the stitching reinforced in places that suggested long use rather than neglect. And there, just near the inside fold, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a small strip of faded material, not a standard patch, not regulation, but not random either, its edges frayed, its color dulled by time. And yet it carried a presence that made Turner hesitate without understanding why. "Sir," he said again, but this time the word lost some of its edge, replaced by a trace of uncertainty he could not fully hide. The old man followed his gaze, not down to the patch, but back to Turner's eyes, as if acknowledging the moment without explaining it. And then he spoke again, quiet, steady, the same tone that refused to rise no matter how much pressure was applied. "You should not touch that." There was no threat in the words, no warning sharpened with intent, just a simple statement that somehow carried more weight than any order Turner had given all day. And for a brief second, he did not move at all. Behind them, the radio operator straightened suddenly, his hand pressing against his headset as the static cleared into something unmistakable, a clipped transmission, distorted but clear enough to carry a single word that slipped through the noise like a memory refusing to stay buried. "Reaper." The operator blinked, heart picking up without reason, and adjusted the frequency again. But the signal vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving only the faint hum of normal operations in its place. He glanced toward the confrontation, a chill settling in his chest, because that word was not random. It was not part of any current call roster, and yet it felt familiar in a way that did not make sense. Staff Sergeant Reed heard it too, just barely, enough to stop his breath for a fraction of a second, enough to pull something old and half-forgotten into focus. He had heard that name once, years ago, not in conversation, not in stories told casually, but in a briefing room where voices were lower and the details were never written down, a name that had not been explained, only respected, and the way it had been spoken then carried the same quiet weight it carried now. Reed's eyes snapped back to the old man, studying him more carefully, the way he stood, the way he did not react to pressure, the way he seemed to exist just slightly outside the normal rhythm of everything around him. Turner did not hear the transmission clearly, but he felt the shift it caused, the subtle change in the air, the way a few people nearby had gone just a little too still, and it irritated him more than it unsettled him. He pushed past the hesitation, straightening his posture, reasserting control the only way he knew how. "I am going to ask you one more time," he said, voice firm again, louder now. "Identify yourself, or I will escort you out of this area." The old man did not answer immediately, and for a moment it looked like he might remain silent again. But then his gaze drifted past Turner once more, not scanning, not searching, just aware, and when he spoke, it was softer than before, almost like he was speaking to something beyond the conversation itself. "You already know enough." The words did not make sense on the surface, but they landed in a way that made Turner's confidence falter for just a heartbeat, a crack so small no one else would have noticed. But it was there. Reed saw it, felt it, and knew in that instant that this was no longer a simple misunderstanding. This was the beginning of something that should have been handled very differently. And without taking his eyes off the scene, he reached slowly for his phone, his instincts finally overriding protocol. Because whatever was about to unfold, it was already bigger than the rank on Turner's collar. Reed stepped back just enough to break line of sight, his movements subtle, controlled, the kind that did not draw attention unless someone was specifically watching for it, and his thumb moved quickly across his phone screen, bypassing the usual contacts, skipping the chain he would normally follow, because something in his gut told him this did not belong in routine channels. He selected a number he had not used in years, one that had only ever been given during a briefing that ended with more silence than explanation, and when the line connected, he did not waste time. "This is Staff Sergeant Lucas Reed," he said quietly, turning his body slightly away from the scene, his eyes never leaving the old man. "I need a verification on a call sign." There was a pause on the other end, not confusion, not delay, just a shift in tone, like a door had quietly closed somewhere far above his pay grade. "Go ahead," the voice replied, calm but suddenly very focused. Reed swallowed once, the word feeling heavier, now that he was about to say it out loud. "Reaper 1. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded, stretching just long enough to confirm that this was not a normal request. When the voice returned, it was different, sharper, stripped of anything casual. "Say that again." Reed did, slower this time, each syllable deliberate. "Reaper 1. Another pause, shorter now, followed by the faint sound of movement on the other end, paper shifting, a chair scraping, then a second voice in the background, lower, urgent, repeating the name as if confirming it against something unseen. Reed felt the weight of it settle deeper into his chest. "Where are you?" the voice asked. Reed gave the base designation, the sector, his exact position down to the nearest access marker. The response came immediately this time. "Do not engage further. Stand by." The line went dead. Reed lowered the phone slowly, his pulse steady but heavier now, and he turned back fully toward the confrontation, the pieces locking into place in a way that made the situation feel suddenly fragile, like one wrong move could break something that had been held together for a long time. Out on the tarmac, Turner had reached the end of his patience. The hesitation from moments ago had hardened into resolve, the need to assert control overriding the unease he could not explain. "That is it," he said, stepping forward again, his voice cutting through the quiet that had gathered around them. "You are leaving." He reached again, this time closing the distance, his hand moving toward the old man's arm with clear intent to guide him away. The old man did not pull back. He did not resist. He simply shifted his weight slightly, not to avoid the contact, but to meet it on his own terms. And for a brief second, when Turner's hand made contact, it felt like gripping something far more solid than expected, not strength in the physical sense, but presence, grounded and unshakable. Turner frowned, the sensation catching him off guard, but he pushed through it, beginning to turn the old man toward the edge of the restricted line. Around them, more people had stopped now, not openly staring, but watching in that quiet, peripheral way that signaled something unusual was happening. The radio operator glanced up again, his headset still resting against one ear, as if waiting for the static to return, while a pair of mechanics stood a few yards away, their conversation forgotten entirely. Reed took a step forward, then stopped himself, the order still echoing in his mind. Do not engage, stand by, and that alone was enough to hold him in place, even as every instinct told him this was about to change. The old man allowed himself to be guided half a step, no more, and then he stopped again, the movement so subtle that it did not look like resistance, just a pause, but it was enough to halt Turner's motion completely. Turner tightened his grip slightly, frustration rising. Sir, do not make this more difficult than it needs to be. The old man turned his head just enough to look at him again, and there was something different in his eyes now, not anger, not challenge, but a quiet recognition, as if he had seen this moment play out before in 100 different forms. It already is, he said softly. Somewhere beyond the immediate scene, far from the heat of the tarmac, a door had opened and a decision had been made, and though no one there could see it yet, the chain of command had already begun to move. The movement stopped there, frozen in a moment that felt too small to matter and yet too heavy to ignore. Turner's hand still on the old man's arm, his grip firm but no longer certain, as if something beneath the surface had shifted in a way he could not quite define. He tightened his jaw, preparing to push through the hesitation again, to finish what he had started, when the sound of boots approaching from behind cut cleanly through the tension. Measured, controlled, and unmistakably deliberate. Corporal, Reed's voice came, calm but edged with something new, something that carried weight without raising volume. Turner glanced over his shoulder, irritation flickering at the interruption, but what he saw in Reed's expression made him pause, just for a second. Reed was not rushing. He was not panicked, but he was focused in a way that Turner had never seen before, his eyes locked not on the situation, but on the man at the center of it. Step back, Reed said quietly. It was not a suggestion. Turner frowned, the authority in the words brushing against his own. Staff Sergeant, I have this under control, he replied, his tone tightening, defensive now. This individual is trespassing in a restricted area. Reed did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply stepped closer, his presence inserting itself into the space with a calm that felt heavier than confrontation. I said step back. There was something in the way he said it, not louder, not sharper, but certain, that made Turner hesitate again, longer this time, his instincts pulling in two directions at once, training telling him to hold his ground, something deeper telling him this was no longer his call to make. Slowly, reluctantly, Turner released his grip and took a half step back, his posture still rigid, his authority not fully surrendered but no longer absolute. The old man did not move. He did not acknowledge the shift. He simply remained where he was, as if he had expected this moment to arrive eventually. Reed positioned himself between Turner and the old man, not blocking, not shielding, just present, his attention fully on the man he had been watching from a distance until now. Up close, the details became clearer, the quiet precision in the way he stood, the stillness that did not come from hesitation but from control, and Reed felt that memory sharpen again. The briefing room, the name spoken once and never repeated, the way even senior officers had gone still when it came up. He swallowed once, steadying his voice. Sir, Reed said, respectful now, not out of protocol but recognition, even if it was not yet complete. I need to ask you something. The old man looked at him, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in his expression, not surprise, not approval, just acknowledgement, as if Reed had stepped onto the right path without being told how. Go ahead, he said. Reed hesitated for a fraction of a second, the weight of the question settling in before he spoke it out loud, because once it was said, there would be no taking it back, no pretending this was something else. Have you ever used the call sign? He stopped, just briefly, the word catching in his throat as the memory aligned with the moment in front of him. Reaper 1. The air seemed to tighten instantly, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that made every sound around them feel distant, like it had been pushed just a little further away. Turner felt it too, standing just behind Reed, his earlier confidence replaced by something colder, something quieter, as he watched the old man's reaction. For a moment, there was nothing. No answer. No denial. Just silence. Then the old man exhaled slowly, not tired, not reluctant, just measured, and his eyes drifted past Reed once more, towards something unseen, something remembered rather than present. It has been a long time, he said softly. The words were simple, but they landed like confirmation, like a door opening that had been sealed for years, and Reed felt it settle fully now. The recognition complete, the unease replaced by something far more certain. Behind them, the distant sound of an engine shifted, growing louder, approaching faster than normal traffic on the base, and though no one had called it in, no one had announced it, the response had already arrived. The sound grew before anyone saw it, a low, steady vibration rolling across the tarmac like distant thunder, not loud enough to alarm, but out of place enough to command attention, and one by one, heads began to turn toward the far end of the runway where a dark vehicle moved with purpose, not fast, not reckless, just direct, cutting through the ordered rhythm of the base without hesitation. Turner followed the movement instinctively, his brow tightening as the vehicle ignored the usual checkpoints, the usual pauses, the silent agreements that governed everything here. And for the first time since this began, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear, but the realization that this situation was no longer contained within his reach. Reed did not look away from the old man, but he heard it, felt it, the confirmation arriving not in words but in motion, and his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Straighter now, more alert, as if bracing for something he already understood. Around them, the bass slowed again, conversations fading, radios lowering in volume. The subtle awareness spreading without announcement that something significant was unfolding. The vehicle came to a controlled stop just beyond the marked line, the engine cutting cleanly, leaving a sudden quiet that pressed against the ears, and for a brief second, nothing happened at all. Then the door opened. A figure stepped out, crisp uniform catching the light, movements precise, deliberate, carrying authority without the need to display it. Colonel David Mercer did not rush, did not call out, did not demand attention, and yet attention found him anyway, snapping quietly into place as those nearby recognized the rank, the presence, the weight of command that followed him like a shadow. Turner straightened immediately, instinct overriding confusion, his posture locking into place as training took hold, but his mind lagged behind, struggling to catch up with what was happening, why a colonel would respond to something as routine as a trespassing civilian. Mercer walked forward, each step measured, his gaze fixed ahead, not scanning the scene, not assessing the perimeter, but locked on a single point as if everything else had already been accounted for. Reed took a half step back, clearing the path without being told, his role shifting without discussion, because whatever came next did not belong to him anymore. The old man remained exactly where he was, unchanged, unmoved, as if the arrival of a senior officer did not alter the situation in the way it should have. Mercer closed the distance, stopping just a few feet away, and for a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy but controlled, the kind that carried more weight than any command, and Turner felt it press down on him, his earlier certainty dissolving under something he could not define. Mercer studied the old man, not quickly, not casually, but with a recognition that unfolded slowly, like a memory aligning with reality, and when it settled, something in his posture shifted, subtle but undeniable. Without a word, without any announcement, Colonel Mercer came to attention. The movement was precise, exact, the kind drilled over years of service, but there was something different in it now, something personal, something that did not belong to routine protocol. Turner's breath caught slightly, confusion sharpening into something colder, because this was not how rank worked, this was not how authority flowed. Reed did not move at all. He had expected this, or at least something close to it. And still, Seeing it happen made the moment feel heavier than anything he had imagined. Mercer held the position for a second longer, then spoke, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying a weight that settled into every corner of the space around them. "Sir," he said, the word deliberate, intentional, directed not upward in rank, but outward in respect. Then, quieter, but unmistakable, he added, "We thought you were gone." The old man looked at him, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift, not surprise, not relief, just acknowledgement, as if a long-closed chapter had been opened again without ceremony. Behind them, Turner stood frozen, the structure he understood beginning to fracture, because nothing in his training had prepared him for this. Nothing had explained how a colonel could stand before a man with no insignia and speak as if he outranked everything in the room. And in that silence, the truth began to settle, not in words, but in the way everyone else had already stopped questioning it. The words settled into the air with a weight that did not fade, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire tarmac had been pulled into a single shared breath that no one dared release. Turner stood where he was, his posture still rigid from instinct, but everything beneath it had shifted, his understanding of the situation no longer aligning with what he was seeing. Because nothing about this matched the rules he had been taught. Nothing explained why a colonel would stand at attention for a man who wore no rank, no insignia, no visible claim to authority. Mercer lowered his salute slowly, not casually, not as routine dismissal, but with a measured control that suggested that gesture had meaning beyond protocol, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet respect that reached further than command ever could. "We have been trying to locate you for a long time," he said, each word deliberate, as if chosen carefully before being allowed to exist in the open. The old man regarded him for a moment, his expression unchanged, but there was a depth behind his eyes now, something older than the base, older than the men standing around him, something that had nothing to prove and no need to explain itself. "I was not lost," he replied simply. The answer was calm, but it carried a finality that made it clear the statement was not open for interpretation. Reed felt that line settle deep, the kind of statement that closed doors rather than opened them, and he understood now that whatever history stood between these two men was not something that would be fully spoken here. Mercer gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, accepting the answer without pressing it, because he understood the weight behind it. "Understood," he said quietly. Around them, the stillness began to take shape, not as confusion anymore, but as recognition, the kind that spread without instruction, one person at a time, until the entire space adjusted to it. A mechanic set his wrench down more carefully than before, a radio operator straightened in his chair without knowing why, and a pair of airmen shifted their stance, their posture aligning unconsciously with something they could not name. Turner felt it too, the shift from uncertainty to something heavier, something that demanded respect without explaining itself. And for the first time since this began, he did not try to assert control, did not try to correct the moment, because he no longer understood where his authority ended and something else began. Mercer turned slightly, just enough to include the space around them, his presence expanding without effort, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, but it carried clearly across the quiet. "Stand easy," he said, not as a dismissal, but as a release, a way of allowing the tension to settle without breaking the respect that had formed in its place. No one moved immediately. The words took a second to register, not because they were unclear, but because the moment itself had changed the way they were heard. Then, slowly, the bass resumed its rhythm, but it was different now, quieter, more aware, as if something unseen had passed through and left an imprint behind. Mercer turned back to the old man, his focus narrowing again, and for a brief second, the authority of his rank seemed almost secondary to the weight of the conversation he was about to continue. "There are people who need to speak with you," he said, his tone respectful, but carrying an urgency that did not need to be emphasized. "It is important." The old man considered this, not quickly, not dismissively, but with the same deliberate calm he had carried from the beginning, and then he gave the slightest nod, a motion so small it could have been missed if anyone had looked away at the wrong moment. "I figured as much," he said. The words were quiet, almost reflective, as if he had expected this outcome long before he stepped onto the tarmac. Turner watched all of it unfold, his earlier certainty now replaced by a growing realization that what he had mistaken for weakness had been something entirely different, something that did not rely on visibility or recognition to exist. And as the silence settled once more, he understood that some names did not need to be announced loudly, because the people who needed to know them already did. The decision settled without ceremony, and with it, the direction of everything that followed. Mercer stepping slightly to the side, not to lead in the traditional sense, but to make space, an unspoken invitation rather than an order, and the old man responded in kind, shifting forward with the same measured pace he had carried from the beginning, as if nothing about the moment required urgency. The two of them moved together across the tarmac, not fast, not slow, but with a quiet alignment. That drew attention without asking for it. Turner remained where he was for a second longer, his mind catching up in fragments, trying to reconcile the man he had stopped minutes ago with the presence now. Walking beside a colonel as if rank itself had rearranged to accommodate him. He glanced toward Reed, searching for explanation, but Reed did not look back, his attention fixed ahead, his posture now fully composed, as if he had stepped into a different role without being told to do so. The bass resumed its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm as before, conversations quieter, movements more deliberate, the subtle awareness lingering in the air like something that could not be unseen once noticed. A pair of airmen stepped aside instinctively as the old man passed, not out of command, not out of instruction, but out of something deeper, something learned without being taught. As they moved, Mercer spoke again, his voice low, meant only for the man beside him, but close enough for Reed to catch fragments of it as he followed a few steps behind. There are records that do not match, Mercer said carefully, choosing each word with precision. Operations that exist without names attached to them. The old man did not look at him, his gaze fixed ahead, but there was a faint shift in his expression, not defensive, not surprised, just aware. That was the point, he replied. The answer came without hesitation, without elaboration, and it closed the space around the question as effectively as any explanation could have. Mercer gave a slight nod, absorbing it, adjusting to it, because whatever he had expected, this was not something that would be unfolded through direct answers. Some of those operations saved people, Mercer continued, his tone steady, respectful, but carrying a quiet weight. A lot of people. The old man's steps did not change, but his eyes shifted slightly, not outward, not toward the base, but inward, as if something older had been stirred by the words, something that did not belong to the present moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less steady. That was also the point. Reed felt the words settle deeper this time, the pattern becoming clearer, not through details, but through absence, through the things that were not being said, the stories that would not be told, and he understood now why the name had never been explained. In that briefing room years ago, why it had been spoken once and then left alone. Behind them, Turner finally moved, not forward to interrupt, not to reclaim control, but simply to follow at a distance, drawn by the gravity of what he had witnessed, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet need to understand, even if he knew he would not be given the full answer. They reached the edge of the secured building, the entrance standing open, guarded but no longer obstructed, and for a moment, the old man paused, not because he needed permission, not because he hesitated, but because the moment itself required it, a natural break between what had been and what was about to begin. Mercer stopped as well, turning slightly toward him, his posture still carrying that same respect that had not faded since his arrival. "They will want to know where you have been," Mercer said. The old man gave the faintest hint of a smile, not amused, not dismissive, just knowing. "They already know enough," he replied. The words echoed the same quiet certainty he had carried from the beginning, and as he stepped forward into the building, the space behind him seemed to hold its breath for just a second longer before releasing it, the base returning fully to motion, but leaving behind the understanding that something had passed through it that did not need to be explained to be remembered. The door closed behind him with a soft, controlled sound, not heavy, not dramatic, but final in a way that marked a clear boundary between two worlds, and for a moment, the corridor inside stood quiet, insulated from the movement outside. The hum of the bass reduced to a distant presence that no longer touched the space he had entered. Mercer walked beside him without speaking. His earlier authority now carried differently, not as command, but as responsibility, as if he understood that whatever came next required more listening than leading. The hallway stretched ahead in clean lines, fluorescent lights casting a steady glow across polished floors, every detail precise, ordered, predictable. And yet the man walking through it did not belong to that order in the way others did, his presence shifting the atmosphere without altering anything visible, like a memory stepping into the present without asking permission. Reed stopped at the threshold, watching them disappear down the corridor, his role ending where theirs continued, and for the first time since this began, he allowed himself to exhale fully, the tension leaving his shoulders not as relief, but as understanding, because he knew now that some things were never meant to be fully explained, only recognized when they appeared. Outside, Turner remained where he was, the heat of the tarmac pressing back in, the normal sounds of the bass returning around him, but nothing felt quite the same anymore. The lines he had relied on no longer as clear as they had been minutes ago. He replayed the moment in his mind, the way the old man had stood, the way the colonel had responded, the way everyone else had shifted without being told. And the realization settled slowly, not all at once, but piece by piece, that respect was not always tied to rank, not always displayed through insignia. Sometimes it existed long before either of those things and remained long after they were gone. Inside the building, Mercer finally spoke again as they approached a secured room, his voice low, careful, as if even now he was aware of the weight of the conversation he was stepping into. "There are people who owe you their lives," he said, not as praise, not as flattery, but as a simple statement of fact. The old man did not slow, did not turn, his steps continuing at the same steady pace he had carried from the beginning. "Then they lived," he replied. The answer came without hesitation, without pride, without expectation of acknowledgement, and it carried a quiet completeness that ended the thought without needing to expand it. Mercer nodded slightly, accepting it, understanding now that whatever recognition existed for this man had never been something he sought, only something others carried because they needed to. They reached the door, secured, guarded, waiting, and Mercer paused just long enough to place his hand against the access panel, the system responding instantly, granting entry without delay, as if the moment itself had already been cleared long before they arrived. The door opened, and for a brief second, the room beyond was visible, figures standing, waiting, the weight of their attention focused entirely on the man who had just stepped inside, and then the door closed again, sealing the moment away from the rest of the world. Outside, the base continued as it always had, aircraft moving, orders being given, routines unfolding with practiced precision. But for those